How we doing? I am Ben Griffith, and this is the Ben Griffith Breakdown. So, in today's episode, we are going to be discussing, you guessed it, the Donald Trump hush money trial that just concluded last week. And for those of you who have been living under a rock for the last month and a half, Donald Trump was on trial for falsifying business records in conjunction with the hush money trial from Stormy Daniels, and was found guilty on all 34 counts. As you can imagine, there was instant outrage from the right. There was thunderous applause from the left. This is a big win for the left, especially because they will probably not see another Trump criminal trial before the election. So I've been following this very, very closely since the indictment came down in March of last year. I followed the trial very, very closely. And I also went back and looked at the history of how this whole thing came about and the charges that were brought. So what I found in the research was that from the start, this case has been nothing more than political weaponization of our justice system. It has been election interference masquerading as blind representation of justice. The left is going on and on about, no one is above the law and all these other things. Well, and that's true. However, no one is below the law either. And as you're going to see as we go through the facts, this justice was far from blind. So there are people out there who are celebrating this, a lot of people in the media. And for those who are celebrating this, you are either completely blinded by ideology or you have no idea about the facts of this case. There are also people out there who are saying, I don't care about the facts of the case. I don't even care if it was fair as long as Donald Trump goes down. And to those people, I would say that you are not only ignorant, but you are very, very, very short-sighted as to what the ramifications of this verdict are going to be moving forward. And the damage that has been done to our judicial system, to our electoral system, and to our standing in the world as a whole. And unfortunately, it is going to be very difficult for us to come back from this as a country. There are going to be ongoing ramifications of this for years, and it is going to be very, very hard to put this genie back in the bottle now that it has been sprung on the American people. So today I want to go through this case start to finish and go through the list of egregious actions that were taken from the beginning of this case, from the indictment all the way through the trial, that would not have been tolerated anywhere in this country, in any court in the land, except for the court prosecuting Donald Trump in Manhattan. So let's get into it. Again, for those of you who aren't familiar with the details of the case, this is a hush money NDA case that goes all the way back to 2016 to stop Stormy Daniels, a porn star, from saying that she had an affair with Trump. The premise of the case is that he falsified business records, and his lawyer, Michael Cohen, paid Stormy Daniels $130,000 to sign an NDA that said nothing ever happened, which she did. She got her money. So, and then Trump paid Michael Cohen back for those fees. The problem was that in the records, in the business records, instead of putting NDA hush money paid to porn star, they put legal expenses. They paid their lawyer who paid her, and they put it down as legal expenses. But apparently that is illegal in the eyes of the Manhattan DA. So keep in mind also that all of these charges are misdemeanors that are beyond their statute of limitations. They were elevated to felonies by saying that they were done to aid or conceal another crime. This is very, very important because it makes a big difference on how this whole thing went down. But we're going to come back to it. But just keep in mind, they're all misdemeanors that were bootstrapped into felonies. So the history of this case is the payment was made in October of 2016. At some point in 2018, Michael Cohen gets raided and this payment comes out. So it's looked at by the Manhattan DA, Cyrus Vance, who was the DA at the time. He starts an investigation. That investigation is paused because the federal U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York began their own investigation, which supersedes him because they are the federal government. They are the feds, they're the DOJ. This is basically the DOJ looking into this. The DOJ takes a look, says, There are no charges to be brought here once we looked at the evidence. So it goes back to Cyrus Vance. He takes a look at it. Prior to retiring, he says, I'm not going to bring charges. I don't think there's any charges to be brought here. Then the current DA, Alvin Bragg, who does eventually bring charges, looks at this and at one point says, I've looked at the charges and I don't think there's any charges to be brought. The Federal Election Committee looked at this because, as we're going to get into, this is being bootstrapped to a felony because they're saying that he violated federal election law. So the Federal Election Committee had looked at this as well, and their committee got together and basically canceled each other out on that committee and decided we're not going to bring any charges as well. So this is where it gets interesting. Every single person who looked at this case from the time it was discovered until 2022, so 4 full years, passed on it. There was no indictments, there was no trials, nothing. November 15th of 2022, Donald Trump says he is going to run for re-election. 20 days later, December 5th, Michael Colangelo, who is the number 3 guy in Biden's Department of Justice, leaves the Department of Justice to go work for Alvin Bragg at the Manhattan DA's office. This guy is the Associate Attorney General for the Justice Department, but he leaves that role to go work for Alvin Bragg. That is unheard of. Bragg immediately starts putting evidence together for a grand jury. Beginning of 2023, he gets his grand jury. And then in March of 2023, indicts Donald Trump on 34 felony counts. So, just to be clear, this is 6 years since the crime happened, 4 years since it was discovered. It has been passed on by every single body that has looked at it. But within 4 months of Donald Trump announcing his reelection, he is indicted on 34 felonies. Any fair-minded person who looks at that can see that that is not coincidental. And that's just the indictment phase, right? So let's look at the case. You have a DA who immediately went after Donald Trump after saying he was running for re-election. This DA also, while running for election for DA, one of his campaign promises was, if you elect me, I will go after Donald Trump. So that in itself is absurd, but is part of the process. The judge representing this case, I really want to go into this judge. Judge Juan Merchan. This guy donated to the Joe Biden campaign. He also donated to a group called Stop Republicans. And people will say, well, it was only $35. But it doesn't matter if it was $35 or $3,500. This guy has shown his hand and donated to a political campaign that he was not even supposed to be donating to, right? He spent his own money to stop Donald Trump from being elected, and now Donald Trump is sitting in his courtroom. He was actually cautioned on this by the state ethics panel because these donations, these political contributions are prohibited, not frowned upon, prohibited under state judicial ethics rules. And they're prohibited for a good reason. If you have someone who is donating to Republicans and they end up with a Democrat sitting in their courtroom, well, now they can be seen as biased, of course. Never mind the guy who you physically donated money against sitting in your courtroom. So this guy should have never ever been sitting in that courtroom. He should have recused himself. He didn't. And I want to go through some of the ridiculous things that this guy let happen in this courtroom. The jury. So the jury was pulled from a group of people where Donald Trump only got 14.5% of the vote in the last election. So less than 15% of the people here approve of Donald Trump, you could say. His lawyers went to that judge and said, we would like a change of venue. We have proven numbers here that say it's very hard for him to get a fair jury here in Manhattan. We'd like a change of venue. of course, this judge says no. He was gagged. This judge gagged him at the beginning of the trial because he was saying things about witnesses. The problem with this gag order was that the witnesses were going on podcasts and other forms of media and saying very negative things about Donald Trump and attacking him. And then he went to defend himself and attacked them back. The judge said, you're not allowed to attack the witnesses in this case, and gagged him. The problem with this was he didn't gag the witnesses. They were still allowed to go on air and make unlimited attacks against Donald Trump, and he was not allowed to defend himself. So think about that. As part of a political prosecution at the height of a presidential campaign, you have a judge silencing the Republican candidate and preventing him from defending himself from these attacks. That is a violation of a First Amendment. And I'm not against, for the record, I'm not against the gag order. I think that what the judge should have done here is said, listen, everybody needs to shut up. None of you can say anything else about anyone else until these proceedings are over. But that's not what happened. So the other thing that's with this case and this judge is this case brought against him was the first time in history a case like this has ever been brought. In history, in any court in the United States, it's the first time that a state prosecutor has used federal election law to substantiate a felony. It just doesn't happen. So to the point that the last DA, the DA Cyrus Vance, when he decided to not bring charges, he said it was due to concerns about, quote, novel issues around using the false statements in connection with committing a crime that violates federal election law. Meaning, this has never been brought before. It's a novel charge, and I don't feel comfortable being the first one to bring it, especially against a former president of the United States, and he was right not to do that. This judge, Juan Merchan, allowed salacious details about Donald Trump from Stormy Daniels, including sexual details that have zero bearing on this case. This was a case about falsifying business records, and the judge allowed a witness to come in and drag him through the mud. True or not, this should have never been allowed. But again, Trump's attorneys asked this judge to bring in a former Federal Election Committee commissioner who's also an expert on election law, Brad Smith. They wanted him to come in and testify as to whether this was kind of a crime or not. The judge said, yeah, he can come in and he can testify, but he can only testify about federal election law in generalities. He can't go into any real detail. So basically what the judge did was say, yeah, you can have your election law expert come in, but he can't discuss election law. I'm the only one here who's going to determine what the law was. So, and on that same note, how do you imply that Donald Trump broke federal election laws when the Federal Election Committee looked at this and their board deadlocked on it and they decided to not bring charges? And according to Brad Smith, that tax expert, the judge did not allow into testimony the fact that the DOJ passed on this and the FEC didn't find any charges either. That's something that the jury should know, and it wasn't allowed into evidence. So why was that? But here's the coup de grace of the ridiculousness of this case and the ridiculousness of this judge. The way that this went down was that there were misdemeanors that were bootstrapped into felonies. But what made them felonies was the attempt to hide an underlying crime. So what was that crime? The simple fact is, no one knew. No one knew until the very end of the trial. It came out right before closing arguments. And what they said was, there's not one thing that makes this a felony, there's a possibility of three things: committing a violation of federal campaign finance laws, falsifying other business records, or violating tax laws. So if you falsified business records to do one of those three things, it made it a felony. So you have option A, B, and C. This is where it gets crazy. The judge told the jury, you do not need to be unanimous on the underlying crime. So you have options A, B, and C. There's 12 people. If 4 of you believe it's A, 4 believe it's B, and 4 believe it's C, I will still consider that a unanimous decision. That is wild. And not only is it wild, it's unconstitutional. That underlying crime should have been brought in the indictment, never mind the trial. The Sixth Amendment requires that any person who's accused of a crime is aware of the charges being brought against them. Also, since 2020, there was a case called Ramos versus Louisiana. Prior to that, there were a handful of situations where you could have a non-unanimous decision in a criminal trial. Since that, you no longer can do that. Every single criminal trial has to be unanimous. A civil trial can still be non-unanimous, but every criminal trial has to have a unanimous decision. You can't just say, if you think it's any one of these things, mix and match, take your pick, you can find this person guilty. So you have a trial with case law that has never been brought in history ever, brought by a DA who vowed to the people of New York that he would go after Trump, presided over by a judge that is openly biased, who donated to Joe Biden, and a jury from a historically anti-Trump area. And people have the audacity to go on air and in the media and say, this was, a fair and just trial, and there's equal justice under the law, and nobody's above the law, and all these other things. And it's absolutely ridiculous. First of all, Trump was, in my opinion, had no chance in this. Geraldo Rivera, who is no fan of Donald Trump, came out and said Donald Trump had no chance in that Manhattan courtroom from the moment he stepped in there, and called it out as being unfair. But the simple fact is, if Donald Trump had not run for re-election, this case would never have been brought. And by the way, all of these other cases that are being brought against him would never have been brought either. Every single one of these cases is only being brought because Donald Trump ran for re-election. And the majority of esteemed legal experts in this country have all looked at this case and said, there are major problems with this case. Ellie Honig from CNN, who, again, no fan of Donald Trump, but is an esteemed legal scholar. I believe he used to be a former federal prosecutor. This guy knows his stuff. He said that the charges against Trump aren't just unusual, they're bespoke, seemingly crafted individually for the former president and no one else. Said this is a Frankenstein case cobbled together with ill-fitting parts into an ugly, awkward, but more or less functioning contraption that just might ultimately turn on its creator. And he went on to say prosecutors got their man for now, at least, but they also contorted the law in an unprecedented manner in their quest to snare their prey. And that is all absolutely true. And again, a guy who is no fan of Donald Trump, but calls it as he sees it. So here's the recap. You have a case that was out there for 4 years and was passed on by the DOJ, the FEC, and 2 Manhattan DAs. One of those DAs who vowed to go after Trump brought charges immediately after his reelection announcement. This case was presided over by an openly biased judge who should have recused himself. Not only should he have recused himself, there should have been some ethics committee or something that stepped in and said, no, we're not having somebody with this record prosecuting a former president. That should have never been allowed to happen. The jury was from an area where Trump had basically zero chance of getting a fair trial. And The charges are charges that have never been brought against anyone ever in the history of the United States, never mind a former president, never mind the candidate for the upcoming president. The facts about the FEC findings weren't allowed into evidence. The list of underlying crimes was never given. The jury didn't need to be unanimous. And here's the thing. We still don't know today why those misdemeanors were felonies. Think about that. Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felonies that were misdemeanors turned into felonies, and he still to this day does not know why those misdemeanors were felonies, because those three options did not need to be unanimous, and the jury didn't need to say who chose what or what the breakdown of that was. The judge doesn't know. The prosecutor doesn't know. The only people who know why those misdemeanors were turned into felonies are the jurors themselves. Think about that. Against a former president of the United States and someone who is running to be president of the United States, was convicted on 34 felonies, and no one can tell the public or him why those misdemeanors were turned into felonies. So the question that everyone is asking me now is, what happens now? So first and foremost, I believe, as most people who have any idea of the facts of this case, that this will be overturned on appeal. The way that works, just so everyone knows, is there's two stages. There's the New York, I believe it's like the New York appellate court, and then there's the New York Supreme Appellate Court. There's two levels of appellate courts in the New York system. And if it goes to both of those, then it can go to the Supreme Court. So there's three phases that this can go through. The amount of reversible error in this case is overwhelming, to say the least. So many things happen in this case that should not have happened, that are ripe for appeal, is, again, overwhelming. And I believe it will get overturned, but it will not get overturned prior to the election. So any damage that will be done to Donald Trump, as far as the election goes, is kind of in stone at this point, because there's really no chance of it getting turned around prior to November 5th. I do not believe that Donald Trump will get jail time. I do believe that they will give him house arrest, because this case has been election interference from the start, and they're not even trying to hide it at this point. So I believe that they'll give him house arrest to keep him off the campaign trail. And I believe, more importantly than anything, that this is going to backfire on Democrats substantially. I do believe that if Donald Trump is elected president in November, I think this will be something that propelled him to that presidency. I think that this will be looked back on history as a contributing factor to that reelection. And, if you guys have been following this at all, you know that since the verdict, Donald Trump has made $60 million in campaign funds in less than a week. So while the indictments were, propping up his polls and his donations, this has been exponential since this verdict came down. But, I think at the end of the day, I said this is going to be hard to put back in the bottle, and I think we're going to have to do something about it as a country. I think at some point we are going to have to pass a law that says no politician at any level can be prosecuted for any crime while they are currently running for any office, whether it's the mayor of a city all the way up to the president of the United States. Otherwise, this is going to get out of hand, because, again, we've opened Pandora's box here. So what might happen is conservative DAs in red states start prosecuting Democrats, which should not happen. But there could be some retribution type trials that happen. So we need to nip this in the bud. We need to put this back in the box, and there needs to be a law that's passed to stop it, because this cannot happen in the United States, or otherwise we are going to turn into Russia or one of these other banana republics that just, if you don't like the guy you're running against, you just put him in jail. We just absolutely cannot have that. So, guys, I'm going to leave it there, and we'll probably go out and do some street interviews on this week. I'm really looking forward to that. But again, questions, comments, leave them in the comment section. I'll get to what I can, and we will go from there, guys, and might even end up doing another episode on this, depending on how things shake out. So we'll talk to you soon, and thanks for watching.